You stopped sharing good news with certain people before you consciously decided to. There was no announcement, no deliberate audit of who was safe and who wasn't. At some point, your brain began routing information. Which version of your life went to which person? And you were several months into that routing before you named it. You called it discretion. You called it privacy. The word you did not use was accurate, but you felt it anyway. The way you feel a word you can't quite locate. You were protecting something, not yourself from them. Something in them from you. That protection instinct is not social intelligence. Social proximity as threat calibration. When someone in a close-knit group begins visibly improving, a promotion, a loss of weight, a relationship that looks genuinely healthy, the people nearest to them don't respond to the change. They respond to what the change implies. The behavior this produces looks like indifference, or quiet distance, or a faint edge in humor that wasn't there 6 months ago. From the outside, it reads like jealousy, which is a morally loaded word that lets everyone off the hook too cleanly. You have been in a room when someone announced something good. You watched the quality of the silence before the response. You have heard the response, warm enough, appropriate enough, and registered something off in the timing of it. The fraction of a second too long before the smile arrived. You cataloged that. You stored it. And then the next time you had something good to share with that same room, your brain ran a quiet calculation before your mouth opened. The calculation is not paranoia. It is accurate pattern recognition that you have been taught to distrust. What people who operate under this first law tend to believe about themselves, that they are perceptive about other people's feelings, and that their restraint in sharing good news is a form of social consideration. Researchers studying status dynamics in small groups found that proximity is the variable that determines threat response. Not the size of the change in one person, but how close that person was already standing. The colleague across the company who gets promoted registers as external information. The friend at the same level who gets promoted registers as internal data about where you stand. The resentment is not about them. It is a response to new information about the self, delivered through someone else's life. In the next conversation, where you notice someone undersell something good that happened to them, correct themselves down. Add a caveat that wasn't necessary. Shrink the story before anyone asks them to. You will now be watching something different than you were watching before. You will be watching someone who has already run the calculation. The underselling is not humility. It is the behavioral signature of a person who has been taught that their growth costs other people something, and has decided to pay that cost in advance. What you have been protecting them from is not your success. It is the information that comparison delivers without asking permission. Containment as relational contract. Relationships form around certain assumptions about range. This is not explicit. Nobody sits across from a new friend and negotiates the ceiling. But the ceiling exists encoded in what gets celebrated, what gets ignored, and what gets met with a slight change in energy that both people pretend not to notice. The assumption is, we exist at roughly this altitude together. The relational contract is, neither of us moves dramatically far from where we both currently are. When one person changes that altitude, visibly, publicly, undeniably, the contract doesn't dissolve, it cracks. The crack produces a specific behavior in the person who did not change. They do not pull away. They stay close and begin, usually unconsciously, applying friction, not hostility. Friction, the sarcasm that lands a half step too hard. The encouragement that comes with a built-in hedge. The question about whether you are sure, delivered from a face that looks like concern. You have received this friction. You may have spent time trying to determine whether the person delivering it was aware of what they were doing. The answer is mostly not. The friction is not a choice. It is the relational immune response to a perceived breach of contract. And here is where the cognitive trap closes. Your likely interpretation of this friction, that the other person is threatened, insecure, not capable of handling your growth, is itself a behavioral expression of the same law. You have just placed yourself outside the dynamic and judged it from elevation, which is exactly the move that made the relational contract feel broken in the first place. A woman in a long-standing friend group started a business, And within 8 months it was generating income that exceeded her peers. She didn't change how she spoke to her friends. She didn't withdraw. What shifted was the texture of the group conversations. The advice they gave her became quietly impractical. The questions they asked were slightly off target. And the celebrations came with a duration that was just short enough to notice. None of them were doing this deliberately. The group had a shared altitude, and her ascent was registering as abandonment. The friction was the contract protecting itself. The person in your life who gives you advice that doesn't quite fit your actual situation, whose suggestions keep landing one level below where you currently are, may not be out of their depth. They may be holding the ceiling in place. Visibility as social aggression. There is a version of growth that other people experience as something done to them. This is not a misperception on their part. It is structurally accurate. In any system where status is relative rather than absolute, a family, a friend group, a company, a neighborhood, one person's movement changes the coordinates of everyone else. You did not intend this. The movement itself is the act. The behavior this law produces in observers is a specific form of suppression. They do not attack the achievement. They undermine the visibility of the achiever. The mechanism is granular. They interrupt the story. They redirect the conversation at the moment of peak relevance. They remember the versions of you that predate the change with unusual warmth. None of these behaviors read as hostile. They read individually as neutral. They function as a system. The same behavior appears across social groups. Studying collective identity. When one member's external identity changes dramatically, the group's response is not to update the shared narrative. It is to amplify the pre-change narrative. The version of you from before your change becomes more frequently referenced, more affectionately held, not because that version was better, but because that version confirmed the group's internal coherence. You have heard a version of yourself described back to you that does not match the current data. The person describing it meant it warmly. That warmth is not false. But what they are doing with that warm description is structural. They are holding a prior version of you at the center of the relationship, because the current version is destabilizing information. In the next week, pay attention to how people refer to your past self in your presence. Note the frequency. Note whether the references increase in direct proportion to how much visible movement has occurred. The pattern will be legible now, in a way it was not legible before. You were reading those references as nostalgia. Some of them are. Some of them are the relational system applying backward pressure. Growth does not require approval to proceed. It requires proximity to people who experience your movement as information, rather than threat. These are not the same people. They rarely come in the same social package. Social belonging and social safety are not the same state. For most of human evolutionary history, they were close enough together that the difference didn't matter. The conditions that made them nearly identical no longer exist. The nervous system did not receive that update. What you suppress to stay legible to a group is not selected randomly. The suppression targets precisely what has changed most. That targeting is mechanically precise. It is not a social malfunction. It is the system operating correctly within a context for which it was not designed. Every person you have ever watched quietly collapse a version of themselves to fit back inside a room was performing an act of biological accuracy. The room registered as survival. The self registered as expendable. That calculation ran in milliseconds, below the threshold where intention operates. The behavior you inherited from that room is still running. What grows under suppression does not disappear. It surfaces later in a context where the original room no longer has jurisdiction, and by then it has been waiting long enough to be unrecognizable. The pattern underneath this one governs what you select for and against in the people you allow to stay close. And that selection process is less visible than anything this video has examined. Think back to the last time something genuinely good happened in your life. Recall the specific moment you decided who to tell first and who you did not tell immediately, if at all. Name that second group precisely. Now ask yourself, what specifically did you expect from them that caused you to root the information away? If you recognized your own calculus in this script, the routing, the underselling, the quiet protection of others from your growth, then you are already past pretending the pattern doesn't exist. The next step is not blame. It is selection. Download the accompanying workbook, the Proximity Audit, a 12-question protocol to identify who experiences your movement as information, who treats it as threat, and where you've been paying the cost of a contract you never signed. Go to the description section to download it for free. No opt-in wall, just the audit.